We continue on values, and my premise, my thesis is that values, the deep values of humanity, the ones that make a human great, come out of tragedy. In other words, as is said frequently, gold needs to be refined by fire. On this chat, I want to return to when I was 6 years of age, and every other Sunday, my family, who lived in, we lived in Memphis, Tennessee, we'd voyage east 40 miles to Somerville, Tennessee to visit my grandparents and to be with my father's extended family. Those were events that are quite rare in America today because everything seems to have changed. In those days, the men would eat first, the women would eat in the kitchen, then the children would eat, and then finally the women would eat in the dining room. And there was a large gathering there. At age 6, I was already well into my invisible script, and I would go when the men gathered in the living room around the wood stove. I would sit over in the corner and be very quiet and listen and observe. Papa, my father's father, sat by the fire. He would feed the fire with pieces of oak wood, chunks, and it was clear that he was the boss of the room. He did not abide children making any noise when the men gathered to talk. And if a child did make a noise, he would sling a piece of firewood, oak firewood at you, and it would slide across the linoleum floor, and you'd have to dodge around in order to not get wounded, because, I mean, that could really hurt. He must have been a great shot because I don't think he ever hit a kid. And I know that I didn't get hit because I was very quiet, very meek, and very invisible as I listened to the men. It was December 1941, and we were at my grandparents' home, and the men had gathered in the living room, and usually they gossiped, they talked about the weather, they talked about crops, they talked about employment, and one of my uncles, who was very racist, would talk about the racial situation in terms that we no longer use in this world. Thank goodness, thank history, thank the evolution of culture in America. Suddenly, as I was watching them, Papa did something differently. He turned the handles on a Zenith radio. He must have been listening to it at a slight version. And he suddenly turned the knob, and all of a sudden we heard, "The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. I repeat, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." And we all sat there stunned. This was different. Instead of doing their usual gossipy male talk, all of a sudden they sat up in their chairs. They looked at each other, they listened more to the radio announcer. "Warplanes, Japanese warplanes have sunk ships, the Missouri, and other ships in the harbor of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii." And when they exhausted the information that was available on this Sunday afternoon, December 7th, 1941, Papa turned the knob and they began to talk. And this was different. This was very different. Tragedy had happened. Deep tragedy. And it was bringing forth something different in my father's family. And I recall they started talking who would be available to go to war. And my Uncle Jack said he would join the Navy. He would go and join up in the next week. Now, he was a man with 2 children. His wife, he would just immediately go and join the Navy. And living in our home, in an apartment, because we lived in the ground floor of a 2-story building and there were several apartments upstairs, there was Hiram and Irene, his wife, and they were young. He was probably 22. Uncle Hiram had given me blood when I needed it, when I was younger. And I can still remember it. In those days, a blood transfusion went up from his bed up in the air, and I could see the blood coming down in my arm. And Uncle Hiram was just a wonderful, wonderful man. And he said, I'm joining the Army tomorrow. Tragedy was bringing out something different in my family. And they were all touched, and they were tender and loving, and they understood Jack joining the Navy and Hiram joining the Army. And I tear up because I loved Uncle Hiram, and he was killed at Anzio Beachhead in Sicily because he volunteered to spray a little swamp, and a mortar killed him. Bomb. But tragedy was bringing out something very deep in humanity, in my family, in my uncles, in my father. My father had a heart defect. He was too old to join the Army, as were many of them. My father had served earlier in between World War I and World War II. He was in a battalion that was guided by General Blackjack Pershing, who was one of the heroes of World War I. But what I want to say is that we're going to learn at deep values. It doesn't make any difference whether you're a Mormon, a Watch Fox channel, an evangelical Christian, an Orthodox Jew, a Muslim. The belief structures, there's something deeper. There is something deeper. Tragedy brings out the deep values of humanity. Because just as my wife and I didn't think when we ran across the highway to try and help a wino, so my family on December 7th, 1941 didn't think about giving their lives in service of their country. Something deep was hit in humanity, and we'll return to this in later chats.